topics in classical Islamic theology, and which Imam Sawi, like the later scholars of Ahl Sunnah, explained with amazing clarity, ease and precision, right? Because speech is a meaning that Allah Most High has affirmed for Himself. But from that arises an issue, which is that if speech is an attribute of God, then is there not a similitude to the characteristics of created things? Because speech is made up of letters and sounds, it has order and parts, it has a beginning and middle and end. All these are the characteristics of created things. So we saw that Ahl Sunnah avoided the excess of the literalists who said that Allah's eternal speech is literally made up, is an attribute, and that attribute is made up of letters and sounds and all of this, which is rationally absurd, as we saw last class. And then they said the Quran is literally the word of God, and the Quran is eternal, and its letters and sounds and everything is eternal in themselves, and that's absurd. But yet we affirm that the Quran is the eternal speech of Allah. How? The key to understanding this is to appreciate that speech has a basis and an end. The basis of speech are how speech is made, how speech arises in originated things, which is letters and sounds and all of these, and it has an end, which is the indication of meanings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's speech is an eternal meaning that Allah possesses, for which we affirm that end of speech, which is indication. The basis of it in created things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is transcendent beyond any such thing. And so that's why speech is defined as an eternal attribute of Allah, subsisting through the entity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, transcendent beyond sounds and letters and any characteristic of temporality. What does speech do? It indicates all that is necessary, possible and impossible. And the Quran is the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because this revealed book necessarily indicates some of that which is indicated by the divine attribute of speech. Right? And we looked at that last class, and he touched upon some, as Imam Sawi does, some of the spiritual elements of this as part of his commitment to connect the seeker of knowledge with appreciation of spirituality and spiritual insights. Okay? And some people we've mentioned have criticized the work for this, but our teachers, well, at least some of our teachers, mentioned that this is one of the distinguishing characteristics of this work, and to be appreciated. So we saw this beautiful insight regarding the, how divine speech is experienced in the hereafter, etc. So this is the divine attribute of speech, and we encouraged those who would like to. This is a topic where delving into it too much can confuse, right? It can confuse, right? And it's more important to have clarity and precision than to read a lot around it without that clarity and precision, because it is very easy to get confused about this noble topic. right? And the most important thing in that is to appreciate, ultimately, there's two things we need to approach with clarity. Allah Most High is the eternal attribute of speech, and that's transcendent beyond the characteristics of created things, like Allah Himself. All His attributes are transcendent beyond the characteristics of created things. Number one. Number two, that the Quran is the speech of Allah, is the revealed speech of Allah, because it indicates that which is indicated by the divine attribute of speech. And that has a spiritual consequence in how we approach the book of Allah, that this is Allah's eternal address to you, enveloped in mercy of a book that you can access. So when you recite the Quran, you are being addressed directly by Allah. You are in a particular presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Okay. So today we're continuing first by completing our look at the affirmative attributes by looking at hearing and seeing, which complete the three divine attributes that are established through transmission. And then there's the issue of the attribute of idrak, of cognition, and whether that is, and what the difference on that is, and some supplementary investigations of issues that are important to understand about the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're at line number 29 of Jawhara al-Tawhid. So he says, حياته كذا الكلام السمع ثم البصر بذي أتانا السمع قوله السمع, his hearing. He says هذه هي قال الإمام الصاوي رحمه الله تعالى هذه هي السادسة من صفات المعاني وهي صفة أزلية قائمة بذاته تعالى تتعلق بجميع الموجودات تعلق إحاطة وانكشاف. وهذا هو التحقيق عند الإمام السنوسي والأشعري رضي الله تعالى عنهما لا بالمسموعات فقط خلافا للسعد. Okay, so this is the sixth. Hearing is the sixth of the attributes of the affirmative attributes, and is an eternal attribute subsisting through the entity of Allah, relating to all existent things with a relationship of encompassing and disclosure. Right? So now there's three questions that arise about hearing and both the attributes of hearing and seeing that we need to be aware of. Number one is that hearing and seeing are distinct from the attribute of knowledge, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala affirms both for Himself. Right? He affirms knowledge for Himself, and He affirms hearing and seeing for Himself. So we affirm them. Allah's knowledge is absolute and complete. As we've seen, Allah's knowledge relates to all that is necessary, all that is possible, and all that is impossible. So the position of Ahl Sunnah is that these are affirmative attributes established through revelation. So we affirm them. They're distinct from knowledge. Knowledge is complete, so these are distinct. So therefore, the ihata, the encompassing and disclosure of hearing and seeing is distinct from that of hearing and seeing. Right? Just as just as hearing and seeing are different, if you see something, you can tell just by your seeing that it is making it looks like it's making noise, and you can hear it's making noise. Right? That's just a facilitative thing that just as our different senses can relate to the same thing but distinctly. Of course, our senses are limited and complementary, etc. Each of Allah's attributes are perfect. They're absolute and eternal. So these are affirmed, they're distinct from knowledge, and we can also discern their distinctness from knowledge in that then that hearing and seeing relate to existent things. Right? So their attachment, what they relate to is distinct from what knowledge relates to. Knowledge relates to necessary, possible, and impossible. All of it. Hearing and seeing relate to the existent, the mawjood, which is all the necessary and a subset of the possible, which is those possible things that Allah has eternally chosen for them to exist. And Imam Sawi says, this is the tahqiq, this is the sound and verified position. According to Imam Sanusi, right, whose biography we've seen, a great 9th century authority in Ash'ari theology, and one of the most influential of the Imams of theology in the last 500-600 years. And Imam al-Ash'ari, one of the two founding Imams of Ahl Sunnah theology, Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and Imam Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. So hearing and seeing relate to all existent things. Anything that exists, Allah hears it and He sees it, whether it is considered audible or visible or not. It does not relate only to the audible, and seeing does not only relate to the visible. Khilafan li-Sa'd, contrary to Sa'd ad-Din al-Taftazani. However, some of the ulama would join between these in that they would say that وَالْجَمْعُ أَنَّهُ قَصَدَ بِالْمَسْمُوعِ كُلَّ مَوْجُودٍ. That the way to, it's very possible to interpret the words of Sa'd ad-Din al-Taftazani that he meant by that hearing, for example, relates to all audible things. By audible things, he meant everything existent. Right? 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 Although what he says about it in Sharh al-Aqa'id or Sharh al-Maqasid may seem to indicate contrary to this, but it's not far-fetched to affirm it in what we've just mentioned, that al-jam'u annahu qasada bil masmu' kull mawjood, that what he means by the audible is every existent thing. Okay. كذا البصر, likewise hearing, الذي هو الصفة السابعة فالخلاف فيه أيضا, and the same difference relates to that. والحق أن تعلقه بالموجودات لا بالمبصرات, and the truth is that Allah's seeing relates to all existent things, not only visible things. فيسمع سبحانه وتعالى الأصوات ولو خفية جدا. So Allah Most High hears all sounds, even if they are exceedingly subtle. كدبيب النملة السوداء في الليل للمظلم, like the sound of the steps of the black ant in the dark of the night. وكذا سيدنا يونس عليه السلام وهو في قعر البحر في بطن الحوت. And likewise, the calling of Sayyidina Yunus when he was in the depths of the ocean, in the belly of the whale. فنداؤه ونداء سيدنا محمد عليه الصلاة والسلام, and his call, the call of Yunus, and the call of our Master Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, Laylat al-Isra, on the night of the heavenly ascent, فوق السماوات السبع, beyond the 7 heavens, مستويان له سبحانه وتعالى, are the same with respect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Because He is transcendent beyond space, as He is transcendent beyond time. There's no time that is closer to eternity than the other. Right? So the beginning of creation, and when the moment everyone enters heaven and hell, and what happens in heaven and hell, none of those times is closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's eternity. Right? It's eternal nowness, so to speak. But likewise, He is absolutely exalted beyond place. There is no place that is closer to Allah than another, and no place that is more distant to Allah than another. So when the Prophet ﷺ ascended heaven and went beyond the highest heavens to the place beyond place, he was not physically closer to Allah. Because no, that is the tanzih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Right? And this was beautifully pointed out by a number of ulama, where the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تفضلوني على يونس ابن متى. Do not deem me superior to Yunus ibn Matta. Now we know necessarily that he, and we'll see that he is without doubt the greatest of the prophets. So how do we understand don't deem me superior to Yunus ibn Matta? I.e. that just because Imam Subki and others explained it, that just because I ascended to the beyond the highest of heavens on the night of Isra, I'm not closer to Allah than Yunus was in the in the belly of the whale. So, right? Because otherwise, we know clearly that تلك الرسل فضلنا بعضهم فوق بعض, right? على بعض, right? These are the prophets. We have chosen some over others, right? So, and we'll see that when we look at the section on prophetology, right? That what's meant by Adam al-Tafdeel, of not preferring some, that don't affirm that some are great and others not quite, right? That's لا نفرق, right? That's لا نفضل بعدم التفريق, by not separating between these were really great and these are kind of like okay. No, they all have the station, the incomparable station of prophethood. Okay. Allah. And then, and the hadith, of course, you can see it in the Sahih as well, right? That don't, right? Don't say I'm superior to Yunus ibn Matta in this particular way. Right? And this is explained by the commentators. And that's one of the characteristics that sometimes as Muslims we take for granted, that if you look in the biblical tradition and stuff, all kinds of unbecoming things are mentioned about the prophets, and we do not accept any such matters. And that's something that sometimes people don't, like people, authors of children's books or are not careful about. And as parents, we need to instill clear understanding of the of what the attributes of prophets are, right? Because it's very important for children to connect to the stories of prophets. Allah. Another of the meanings, of course, of the Prophet ﷺ saying, "La tufaddiluni ala Yunus," don't deem me superior to Yunus. Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria Ansari says in his commentary Sahih al-Bukhari that it means that the Prophet ﷺ said that out of humility, out of humility, right? Right, and because that what's prohibited is to لأن المنع هو في ذات النبوة والرسالة, that the prohibition is not to compare between them in the very station of the Prophet. Every Prophet has the station and necessary characteristics of prophets, right? So in that they're the same and there's no تفاضل. إنما التفاضل في زيادة الأحوال والرتب, right? So that's just a side point of benefit, right? Then he says, right, and you can find the hadith لا تفضلوني على يونس بن متى in the in the major work in the Sahih and the other major works, right? And okay. وَيُبْصِرُ الْأَشْيَاء وَلَوْ دَقِيقَةً, and Allah Most High sees all things, even if subtle. قَالَ بَعْضُهُمْ يَا مَنْ يَرَى مَدَّ الْبَعُوضِ جَنَاحَهَا فِي ظُلْمَةِ اللَّيْلِ الْبَهِيمِ الْأَلْيَلِ, right? O you who beholds the stretching of the flea, of its wings, in the most intense and dark of dark nights. لكن سمع الله سبحانه وتعالى ليس بصماخ وآذان وبصره سبحانه ليس بحدقة وأجفان. But Allah's Most High's hearing is not by ears nor eardrums, because these are the characteristics of created things. Allah is exalted beyond these created means, and His seeing is not with eyes and all they contain. ليس كمثله شيء. There's absolutely nothing like unto Him. بذي أتانا السمع. This is what has come to us in transmission, in revelation. اسم الإشارة عائد على الصفات الثلاثة الكلام والسمع والبصر. This referential بذي, these, goes back to the last three attributes we've looked at: speech, hearing and seeing. أي إن دليل هذه الصفات الثلاثة نقلي من الكتاب والسنة والإجماع. That the proof of these three attributes is by transmission from the book and the sunnah and by established scholarly consensus. والتواتر, and it's mass transmitted. Right? قال الله تعالى وكلم الله موسى تكليما. Allah Most High and tells us in the Quran, Allah spoke to Moses with true speech. Right? And one of the roles of this ta'keed is nafyu al-majaz. It negates the metaphorical. وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, and He is the hearing and the seeing. Right? From the Quran, Surah An-Nisa verse 164 and Ash-Shura verse 11. Now, then he tells us وأجمع أهل الأديان والعقلاء أن على أنه تعالى سميع بصير متكلم. The people of all religious traditions and all people of reason agreed that Allah Most High is hearing and seeing and speaking. Because people of reason, who's a person of reason? It's not an intelligent person. Right? Imam al-Juwayni mentioned the intelligent person, the aqil, is someone who knows the necessary to be necessary, the possible to be possible, and the absurd to be absurd. Otherwise, they're not fit to be deemed rational, right? So, a smart atheist, we would say, well, they may be smart, but they're not. That's a dimension of intelligence that they're lacking. وَالْمُشْتَقُ يَدُلُّ عَلَى الْمُشْتَقِّ مِنْهُ. And that which is derived indicates the affirmation of what it is derived from. What is al-mushtaq? أي كونه سميعا. His being hearing indicates that he has the attribute of, right, of hearing. His seeing indicates that he has the attribute of seeing, right? خلافا للمعتزلة, contrary to the Mu'tazila. Now this is a rhetorical tool, right? But that, look, everybody. So that's why he goes wide. And you notice the rhetorical tools of argument, right? I mean, the people of other faith traditions have learned all kinds of absurd things about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I said, look, all people of religion, any sane person would affirm this. Right? And contrary to the Mu'tazila, right? This is a rhetorical tool. Of course, this is not a rigorous argument against them, because the purpose here is not to make a rigorous argument. This is not a book of rigorous proofs. Right? This is not here to give a detailed refutation of the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila have their arguments, even though ultimately they are refuted, but this is not the point. This is more of a rhetorical deflection than a rational case against the Mu'tazila, and we have to be fair. Because that's not the scope of a book like this. النافين للمعاني. Contrary to the Mu'tazila, the rationalist sect, the major rationalist sect within Islam, who negated the affirmative attributes. حيث قالوا سميع بلا سمع بل بذاته وكذا. Because they said that Allah hears without the attribute of hearing. Rather, He hears by His entity alone. We say no, someone who hears, we say they have the attribute of hearing. Someone who, they say هو قادر بذاته لا بصفة تسمى قدرة. That He is powerful by His entity, not by an attribute called power. You say no, someone who's powerful, you'd say about them that the attribute of power. And he mentioned this principle before. المشتق يدل على المشتق منه. وأما إنكار كونه سبحانه سميعا وهكذا فهو كفر. As for denying that Allah Most High is hearing and so on, and these are what's called the صفات المعنوية, that denial is disbelief. Right? Someone says Allah is not here, Allah is not living, is not willing, is not powerful. Right? Likewise, Allah is not speaking, hearing, seeing. Denying these is disbelief. Denying because that's why the ulama distinguish between as-sifat al-ma'nawiyya, His being, living, willing, powerful, etc. Right? They said they affirm both the attributes of affirmation, the sifat al-ma'nawiyya, and the sifat al-ma'ani, the affirmative attributes, that He has life, knowledge, will, power. Because the Mu'tazila denied the affirmative attributes. But the affirmations from those, that He is living, willing, powerful, etc., they did affirm those. Denying the affirmations themselves, Because they didn't consider them attributes. They said he has all those affirmations by his entity, not by attributes. But أما إنكار كونه سميعا وهكذا فهو كفر لأنه صادم الوارد صراحة. That denying his being, hearing, and so on, living, willing, knowing, willing, powerful, etc. That is disbelief, because that goes against what's explicitly transmitted. وإنما كانت أدلة that's one issue. Separate issue. وإنما كانت أدلة هذه الصفات الثلاثة نقلية لأن إيجاد العالم ليس متوقفا عليها. The proofs of these three last attributes, namely speech, hearing, and seeing, are transmitted because the originating of existence, al-alam, أي كل موجود سوى الله تعالى, of this world, meaning everything that exists besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is not dependent upon these attributes. Right? Meaning that sound reason would have, if you said, okay, if you go to first principles, this world is originated. Anything originated requires an originator. So given that this world is originated, it requires an originator. The originator necessarily is characterized by existence, and he must be necessary. And what attribute? And of course, all the negative attributes would be affirmed. But what affirmative attributes, what meanings would be affirmed for the Creator? The Creator must have life, knowledge, will, and power. These are the attributes that that unaided but sound reason that doesn't err due to heedlessness, due to short-sightedness, due to haste, due to emotion, whim, desire, darkness, weakness of capacity. Right? These are all the things that sway sound reason, or there's some of the things that sway sound reason. فإن الفرض أن علمه تعالى محيط بحقائق الواجبات والجائزات والمستحيلات على ما هي عليه تفصيلا في كل جزئية فهو غني عن المؤكد. Right? Because what is understood is that Allah's knowledge encompasses all the realities of the necessary, the possible, and the impossible as they fully are. In detail of every particular. So his knowledge does not need anything that reinforces it. Right? So then what is the nature of this mughayara, this distinction between the inkishaf, the disclosure of knowledge, and the disclosure of hearing and seeing? We don't know its reality. We affirm it because Allah has affirmed it. We appreciate the distinction. We can discern the distinction between seeing and hearing, likewise between seeing and hearing and knowledge. But how does that relate to the knowledge of Allah? We do affirm the transcendence of Allah's knowledge beyond any imperfection or beyond any need. So Allah's knowledge does not need seeing and hearing to know absolutely. Another, the commentator, the editor gave another interpretation of فهو غني عن المؤكد. It also could be a refutation of some of the Maturidis who said, and some Ash'aris, or many of the Maturidis, some of the Ash'aris who said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hearing and seeing are rationally established. And they gave a series of arguments for it. You can see that discussion in the larger works, but don't get distracted. Then he says in line 30, فَهَلْ لَهُ إِدْرَاكٌ أَوْ لَا خُلْفُ وَعِنْدَ قَوْمٍ صَحَّ فِيهِ الْوَقْفُ. Does he have the attribute of idrak, of cognition, and we'll see what that means, or not? There's difference of opinion, and according to some people, we neither affirm it nor deny it, waqf. The most simple reason is, rationally, it's not required because of the other attributes that have been affirmed. And in transmission, we don't find this word explicitly. This difference goes back also to how you like, and similar difference arises about the divine attribute of taqween, right, which is affirmed by the majority of the Maturidiyya, rahmatullahi alayhim wa nasarahum, and not affirmed generally by the Ash'aris. But it goes back to how of fashion, the attribute of taqween, literally of originating, right? Because so they distinguish between, they define qudra distinctly from how the Ash'aris define qudra, that there's ability and power. So taqween is the creative power, right? So this capacity, the power is like capacity, and the Ash'aris considered both together. So some of this is a matter of how, there's a reality and how you affirm it. Others say no, it's a real difference. And what do you mean by real difference? There's a real difference as to whether there's a real difference. فقوله فهل له إدراك إلى آخره حاصله أنهم اختلفوا هل للمولى صفة زائدة على سبع المعاني تسمى الإدراك. The summary of this issue is that they, meaning the ulama of Ahl Sunnah, differed. Does our Lord Mighty and Majestic have an extra attribute beyond these 7 affirmative attributes named idrak, cognition? يدرك بها الملموسات يدرك بها الملموسات والمذوقات والمشمومات لأنها كمالات وكل كمال يجب أن يثبت له أو لا لأنه لم يرد إطلاقه على الله سبحانه وصفة العلم مغنية عنه. So this attribute of cognition, they said, by which Allah discerns all that may be touched or tasted or smelled, because these are perfections for Him, and every perfection is necessary to affirm for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or no, that He does not have this attribute. It is not a meaning that needs to be affirmed for Him, because number one, it's not it's not been transmitted. We don't see the affirmation of that as an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's in terms of transmission, naqlan and aqlan, because the attribute of knowledge is a sufficiency from this attribute. وَقِيلَ بِالْوَقْفِ. Others said we don't need to deny it, we just stop. وهو الأصح, and that's more sound. لأنه وإن لم يرد إطلاقه لكنه كمال, because even though it has not been transmitted, but it is a perfection. فلا نثبته ولا ننفيه, so we don't affirm it, and we don't negate it. وعلى القول بإثباته, and on the opinion that affirms it. فقيل يتعلق بالملموسات والمذوقات والمشمومات. Some said it relates to all that may be touched or tasted or smelled. وقيل يتعلق بالموجودات. Others said it relates to all existent things. وقيل هو صفات ثلاث. Others said this is actually 3 attributes. على حسب تعلقه بالملموسات والمشمومات والمذوقات, in accordance with its relationships with what is touched or what is smelled, or what is tasted. فتكون صفات المعاني عشرة. So therefore, the affirmative attributes would be 10. This is all the, just detailing out the weaker opinion. ومن نفاها أو صحح الوقف, and whoever negated it or deemed it correct sound to just to stop and neither affirm nor deny it. بنى ذلك على أن دليل الصفات الثلاثة نقلي. Built this that the proof of the three final attributes, namely speech, hearing, and seeing, is transmitted. لأن العقلية أي لأن الدليل العقلية أي لها ضعيف, because the rational proof for affirming those attributes is on its own weak. It's on its own insufficient. The intellect could discern that they are perfections, but it's not sufficient to affirm that, given the reality that the originating of the world is not dependent upon them, as we saw previously. فإنه لا يلزم من كونها كمالا في حق الحوادث كونها كمالا في حقه تعالى, because it's not entailed by these qualities being perfections for originated things, that they be perfections with respect to في حق القديم, with respect to the eternal subhanahu, right? That's the attribute of cognition. It didn't really have to be mentioned per se. That's why other texts like the Kharida don't even open this topic, but it's there, and part of the wisdom of the ulama giving us these mafatih. Sometimes you say, like, why go into this? Part of it is because there is a khilaf. This gives you the summary of the khilaf. You retain something like this. When you go to the larger books, you know how to navigate it. Yeah, there's difference here. Someone's making a compelling argument. Oh my goodness, what do I do with this? Habak al-mas'ada. Right? He granted you the means of ascent in the degrees of clarity. قوله خلف خبر للمبتدأ محذوف تقديره في جوابه خلف أي اختلاف. So خلف refers to اختلاف, difference of opinion. He does the i'rab of it. Then he goes into what are called the attributes of affirmation, الصفات المعنوية. These are not actual attributes. They say الصفات المعنوية عبارة عن قيام صفات المعاني بالذات. Right? The attributes of affirmation are, express the ascription of the affirmative attributes to the entity of Allah. So if the affirmative attribute is life, we ascribe life to the entity of Allah. We say He is living. We ascribe the affirmative attribute of will, of irada, to the entity of Allah. So we say He is willing, He is murid. We ascribe the affirmative attribute of qudra, of power, to the entity of Allah. So we say He is qadir, He is willing. Those ulama who affirmed a distinction between they said that there's a difference between there's things that are non-existence. There's adam. There's nothing that is non-existent, because non-existence is nothingness, right? There's adam and there's wujud. There's non-existence and existence. Between them, there is something called a hal, a state. Right? So he said, and they differentiated between the wujud, between something existence, and a state that in a number of ways, and we don't need to go into that, it comes up in later texts, so just to give a. So they said that الوجود ما له تحقق في الخارج. Right? Something existence is that which has external realization. They say بحيث يصح عقلا أن يرى, such that it is rationally possible to see the existent thing itself. But states are meanings that are affirmed but are not, so for example, when we say Zayd is standing, can you see standing itself? No. So they say that's a hal. And there's technical reasons for the differentiation. The position of Ahl Sunnah, the majority position, is وَالْتَحْقِيقُ أَنَّهُ لَا حَالٍ, is that we don't affirm states, that there's non-existence and existence, but there's maratib of wujud. There's levels of existence. Things like standing, like qiyam, for example, etc. These are called umur i'tibariyya, right? Umur i'tibariyya which exist, right? But these are just some mafatih. The detail of this is beyond the scope here. So because of this, the ulama also, to close because there's a need to establish limits, but the point of limits is not to kick everybody out, right? So the Mu'tazila, for example, or a confused individual, if they say, no, I don't believe there's eternal attributes, Allah is powerful, but He doesn't have an attribute called power, because then they say a rationally confused thing. As long as they say He's powerful, we don't deem them to be kafir. We just say they're confused. If it is explained to them and they're not dim-witted, we say that's fisq fil i'tiqad. That's a corrupt belief. It's absurd. Or it's tahakkum. They're just being stubborn. Or they're dim-witted, right? But it's not kufr. But they kept this distinction. One, to clarify that the Mu'tazila would not be kafir for denying the affirmative attributes. Number two, just to tell us what are the implications of the affirmative. So just for tawdih, right? Also, it's a bridge to appreciating the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because we have the affirmative attributes. They subsist through the entity of Allah. But when we ascribe them to the entity of Allah, we can call upon Allah by these ascriptions. So when we say Hayyun Alimun Qadirun Muridu, we can say Huwa al-Hayy, al-Alim, right? Al-Murid, al-Sami' al-Basir, al-Mutakallim, right? Etc. Right? So the attributes of affirmation help us understand the bridge between an attribute and a name. Guys, because a name is the ascription of an attribute to Allah, such that we call upon Allah by the personal name expressing the ascription of that attribute to the divine. Okay. Hayyun alimun qadirun muridu ila akhirih. He says قوله حي لما فرغ رحمه الله تعالى أي الإمام اللقاني في الجوهرة من صفات المعاني شرع يتكلم على الصفات المعنوية والصفات هي كونه حيا وأما الحي فهو اسم من أسمائه تعالى. Right? So once he finished looking at the affirmative attributes, he now begins discussing the attributes of affirmation, the sifat al-ma'nawiyya, and the attribute is his being living. Amma al-hayy, as for the living, that is one of the names of Allah Most High. وَدَلِيلُهَا أي دليل الصفات المعنوية هو دليل المعاني. And the proof of the attributes of affirmation is the same as the affirmative attributes. لأنها ملازمة لها, because they are necessarily interrelated. لأن كونه حيا إلى آخره يستلزم حياة وهكذا. Because his being, living, etc., the attributes of affirmation, entails that he has the attribute, the affirmative attribute of life, etc. وحياته تعالى حقيقية ذاتية. Allah's life is real and intrinsic. Right? It's intrinsic. Right? Right? وأما حياة الحادث فهي عرضية قابلة للزوال في كل لحظة. As for the life of originated things, it is an accident. But accident doesn't mean that random, meaning that it is contingent, dependent, and it is susceptible to be dispelled, to be lifted at any moment. كونه عليما, his being, قوله عليم أي من صفاته سبحانه كونه عليما بالواجبات والجائزات والمستحيلات, his being knowing, right, from his attributes of affirmation, his being knowing of the necessary, the possible and the impossible. فالصفة أي الصفة المعنوية هي كونه عليما وعالما. So the attribute of affirmation is his being knowing. والاسم عليم وعالم, that Allah is al-alim, al-alim, al-allam. وتقدم الدليل عليه, and we've seen the proof of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge. قوله قادر, هذا هو الاسم أيضا. وأما الصفة فهي كونه قادرا. This is the name, that Allah is al-qadir and al-qadir and al-muqtadir. There's a number of related names that highlight aspects and implications of the qudra of Allah, of the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imam al-Ghazali and others in their works on the 99 names tell us why the same attribute has a whole range of ways that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about himself regarding them. And we had mentioned this before, it's a good exercise and you won't be hurt by doing it, is number one, just at least read the section from Al-Aqidah Al-Islamiyya by Shaykh Abdul Rahman Habannaka rahimahullah ta'ala on the relationship, on how the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala return back in meanings to the essential attributes of Allah, mighty and majestic. That's a very useful section, and it helps us reflect on what we've looked at in terms of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you're able to take notes on it and diagram it for yourself, it'll help you retain this, and this is a tool of reflection. It's very beneficial. At the very least, let's share that extract from the work, and we could include it here بإذن الله تعالى. الله قوله مريد, هذا هو الاسم أيضا. وأما الصفة فهي كونه مريدا وتقدم الدليل عليها أيضا. Murid, willing, this is the name. The attribute is his being willing, and we've taken the proof of that. قوله سمع بحذف الياء للضرورة. سمع أي سميع. The ya was omitted للضرورة أي لضرورة الشعر, because of the necessity of poetry, because classical Arabic poetry is based on rigorous meter. وهذا هو الاسم أيضا. This again is the name. كونه بصيرا, his being hearing. This is the أما الصفة فهي كونه سميعا بصيرا. As for the attribute, it's i.e. the attribute of affirmation, it's his being hearing and seeing. وتقدم أن دليلها سمعي, and we've taken that their proof is transmitted. قال تعالى وهو السميع البصير, and he is the hearing and the seeing, from Surah Ash-Shura verse 11. قوله ما يشاء يريد, whatever he wills ما يشاء يريد. Whatever he wills, he chooses. أشار بذلك إلى أن المشيئة والإرادة مترادفان. Right? That Allah's mashi'a and irada, His willing and choosing, are the same, are synonymous. خلافا لمن فرق بينهما, contrary to those who tried to make a distinction between the two. فما أراده أزلا أظهره فيما لا يزال. So whatever He has willed eternally, He manifests temporally. ومراداته تعالى هي شؤونه في خلقه. And what Allah wills are His affairs in His creation. كالخلق والرزق والإحياء والإماتة والخفض والرفع, such as His creating and His providing and His giving life and His giving death and His abasing and His raising. حكي أن ابن الشجري رحمه الله, one of the great Imams of the Arabic language, who died in the year 450 Hijrah in Baghdad, كان يقرر في درسه قوله سبحانه وتعالى كل يوم هو في شأن. Every day he is engaged in his affairs. فسأله سائل وقال له ما شأن ربك اليوم. So a questioner asked him, what is the affair of your Lord today? فأطرق رأسه. So this great scholar Ibn Shajari lowered his head. وقام متحيرا. And he stood up bewildered, in the sense of awe of the divine. فنام, so he slept. فرأى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, فرأى النبي صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم فسأله عن ذلك. And he asked him about that. And this is from the humility of the scholars who are the inheritors of the prophets, that many of them, they would be very quick to say لا أدري, I don't know. And this is al-akthar, and that's the more common state. Although there are others, that those include Imam Abu Hanifa, who almost never said I don't know. Right? And they say, some say there's only 3 issues that Imam Abu Hanifa ever said I don't know to. And those were because there's no decisive answer to those. Like what is meant by dahr? What is the age of circumcision? And they say others said there's no 5, 7 questions. Lo, Imam Abu Hanifa didn't always answer a question. When he'd be asked questions, he'd let his own students answer. He'd be the last person to answer. Right? And that's from the wisdom of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. Anyways, so Ibn Shajari saw the Prophet ﷺ in his dream. فَسَأَلَهُ عَنْ ذَلِكَ. So he asked him regarding this. فَقَالَ لَهُ السَّائِلُ لَكَ الْخَضِرُ. So the Prophet ﷺ told him that the one who asked you is al-Khadir. فَإِذَا أَتَاكَ فِي غَدٍ وَسَأَلَكَ فَقُلْ لَهُ شؤون يبديها ولا يبتديها يرفع أقواما ويضع آخرين. He said that was al-Khadir who came to test you. So if he comes tomorrow and he asks you, then tell him that affairs that he manifests, but that he does not begin. He does not begin. يبتديها, that Allah is not engaged in things in the sense that Allah is not reacting and responding to what is happening, because that's the characteristic of originated things. Allah exists eternally, and His knowledge of what happens in time is eternal. Time does not relate to Him. So what you do now is not mubtada to Allah, is not a new thing to Allah. Allah does not acquire knowledge of it. And then what happens as a result of that? Allah is not responding with His will and His power. That is eternal. Right? Of course, there's a lot of confusion about this, and beware, because people talk about things like the silent God and this and that, okay, well, people are calling upon God, where is He? Inni qareeb. Allah has told us. Ujibu da'wat ad-da'i then. I answer the call. But His answering is manifest temporally. It doesn't happen. The answer تقدمت كل الكائنات حديثها. Right? His will precedes all originated things. Because they only came to be, kun fayakun. When he said be, he specified them with his will. Then they became. Right? Shu'unun yubdiha, affairs that he manifests. But he is not. La yabtadiha, he is not reacting to them. Yarfa'u aqwaman, he raises some people and he abases others. Referring to, right? There's a hadith of, you mentioned by Imam al-Bukhari, by Ibn Majah and Ibn Hibban. Some people like the fact that Imam al-Bukhari related something. Sometimes people like putting that first. We have to be clear. When we say akhraj al-Bukhari, it refers to what? To his sahih. Right? That is muqaddam ala al-kull. Right? He is Imam al-Muhaddithin. He's the Imam of the Muhaddithin. Right? So it's, if you reference a hadith, you put Imam al-Bukhari first, insofar, if you're quoting from his sahih. But because of the author, sometimes people will mention akhrajahu al-Bukhari fil adab al-mufrad. Al-Bukhari mentioned it in al-adab al-mufrad. But Imam al-Bukhari adhered to the highest standards and applied them most rigorously in his sahih. He did not set the same standard for what he mentions in his other works, like al-adab al-mufrad, for example. He did not set this. And then other works actually are great sources for identifying other levels of hadith, amongst them his tarikh and so on. Right? So the fact that, so the point thing is that if Imam al-Bukhari mentioned it in other than his sahih, like here in his tarikh, right? Doesn't mean it's a sahih hadith. Right? So there's two things. In terms of this rank of the author, yes, you put Imam Bukhari first, but in terms of the level of the hadith, you say, the normal referencing, because that's not the tarikh of Imam Bukhari is not a primary source of hadith, right? In terms of the corpus of hadith literature. So, so in that sense, you say, akhrajahu Ibn Majah wa Ibn Hibban wa huwa fi tarikh al-Bukhari. Of course, and if you looked, you would find it in many other books. But you have to be wary as well. Shaykh Abdul Fattah Bism is not trying to get anything past you. But sometimes people will say that Bukhari related in Tarikh al-Kabir. He related all kinds of stuff there. That's not a support, right? But some of the ulama, they're not trying to make some kind of unfair argument. They'll mention it first because لِجَلَالَةِ قَدْرِ الْبُخَارِ. Okay. فلما أصبح أتاه أي الخضر وسأله أي سأل ابن الشجري فأجابه بما ذكر فقال صل على من علمك ومشى مسرعا. So next day when this great scholar Ibn Shajari woke up, Al-Khadir came to him and asked him the question, what are the affairs of your Lord? So Ibn Shajari responded with what he had heard from the Prophet ﷺ in his dream. So Al-Khadir said to him, send blessings upon the one who taught you, and he left in haste. And some people say, why mention something like this in the book of Aqeedah? Because it's not a point of Aqeedah. It brings out a meaning and tells us about a reality that seeing the Prophet ﷺ in dream is a reality. Allah gifts it to His righteous servants. But of course, we only accept claims of dreams just as we don't deny anybody saw or anything, but we don't neither affirm it nor deny it. But we exercise caution when it comes to people's claims of dreams, especially when they're calling us to say or do anything. But we say that's between that person and their Lord. But someone of established righteousness, uprightness, knowledge, then their dreams are they're not of, they don't establish proof, but they're of consideration. The Prophet ﷺ, it is well-established hadith. After Fajr, he used to ask who's had a good dream, so we could, and they used to talk about their dreams with, what with balance. It was just a peripheral matter in the Sunnah. It's not, we live life. We don't just dream dreams, right? ورد إن في كل يوم وليلة لكل إنسان 100,000 نفس و24 ألف نفس. It is said, it's related that in every day and night, each person has 124,000 breaths. وفي كل نفس يموت 100,000. And in every breath, 100,000 die. ويولد 100,000. And 100,000 are born. وتحمل 100,000. And 100,000 become pregnant. ويفرج عن 100,000. And 100,000 are granted openings or relief. ويعز 100,000. And 100,000 are honored. ويذل 100,000. And 100,000 are abased. ويعتق من النار 100,000. And 100,000 are freed from hellfire. Right? Right? It's related. The author doesn't say this is a hadith. It says it's related from some of the righteous. وقيل في كل نفس 600,000. Others said that in every breath there's 600,000 of each of these things. ومع هذا كله الملائكة أكثر المخلوقات. And despite this, the most numerous of Allah's creation are the angels. فقد قال السنهاجي, and السنهاجي said, and he's also known as Ibn Shabith في كنز الأسرار, إن بني آدم عشر الجن, that humans are 1/10 of the number of the jinn. وبني آدم والجن عشر حيوانات البر, that humans and jinn are 1/10 of the number of animals on earth. وهؤلاء كلهم عشر الطيور, and those are just 1/10 of the number of birds. وهؤلاء كلهم عشر حيوانات البحار, and all of those are 1/10 of the animals of the ocean or the creatures of the ocean. وهؤلاء كلهم عشر ملائكة الأرض, and all of those are 1/10 of the angels just on earth. وهؤلاء كلهم عشر ملائكة سماء الدنيا, and all those are 1/10 of the angels of the sky. وهؤلاء كلهم عشر ملائكة السماء الثانية, and all those angels of the earthly sky are 1/10 of the angels of the second heavens. وهكذا إلى الكرسي, and likewise to the divine throne, إلى العرش, to the divine dais, and then the divine throne. That's just a sort of, let's relax and be inspired. These are not points of aqidah. You don't need to take notes on that or anything. A point of method, of course, is that this dream gives some insight into this verse. كل يوم هو في شأن. What a talib ilm would do in a situation like this is, where do you take tafsir from? You take tafsir from the books of tafsir. You go to one of the reference tafsirs, An-Nasafi, for example, or Abu Saud, etc., or Sawi on the Jalalain itself, and just write down what is the tafsir of كل يوم هو في شأن from Surah Al-Rahman, verse 29. Then he says, متكلم ثم صفات الذات ليست بغير أو بعين الذات. Is it ليست بغير أو ليست بغير؟ ليست بغير أو بعين الذات. قوله متكلم, his speaking, هذا هو الاسم وأما الصفة فهي كونه متكلما. This is the name, speaking. As for the attribute of affirmation, it's his being speaking. And وَتَقَدَّمَ الْكَلَامُ بِدَلِيلِهِ. And we've discussed the attribute of speech and its proof. Then he says ثُمَّ صِفَاتُ الذَّاتِ. Right? لَيْسَتْ بِعَيْنٍ وَلَا بِغَيْرِ الذَّاتِ. So now he has a final discussion, which is then the attributes of Allah's entity, they're not the entity itself, nor other than the entity. Right? And this is one is just it's a true. So the attribute is not the entity itself. Right? If you know the aql يدرك تماما المغايرة بين الصفة والموصوف. The intellect discerns clearly the difference between the attribute and what is attributed to. So if you say Zayd's knowledge, right? You can say, okay, let's talk about knowledge. You can conceive of the attribute, right? The knowledge is not Zayd himself, right? Right? So Zayd, for example, if he walked into the wall and lost all his knowledge, is he still Zayd? Right? So it's not, the attribute is not Zayd himself in the sense that تعقل الذات دون اشتراط تعقل الصفة. You can think of the entity without having to think about the attribute. So the attribute is not the entity itself. You can conceive of the entity without having to conceive of the attribute, and you can conceive of the attribute without having to conceive of the entity. You can think of knowledge on its own without having to think of the entity. However, so it's ليست بعين, but can an attribute exist without what it's an attribute of? Here's some knowledge. Here's some life. Whose life? Right? الصفة لا تقوم إلا بموصوف. Right? An attribute is only established through an entity. So in that sense, the attribute is not the entity itself and not other than the entity. So he says, هذه المسألة ثم صفات ذاته, then the attributes of Allah's entity. هذه المسألة قصد بها المصنف رحمه الله تعالى الرد على المعتزلة حيث أوردوا على أهل السنة شبهة حاصلها إنكم ادعيتم وجود صفات المعاني وقدمها وقد كفرتم النصارى بزيادة إلهين فأنتم من باب أولى في الكفر لإثبات قدماء ثمانية. Says in this issue he refutes the Mu'tazilite who brought a claim against Ahl Sunnah, that whose summary is that you claim that there are these 7 affirmative attributes and they're all eternal, but yet you deem the Christians to be disbelievers because they added 2 gods, two eternal beings to Allah, to God. But you therefore would be more deserving of being disbelievers because you have affirmed 8 eternal beings. وحاصل الجواب أن المحظور المبطل للتوحيد إنما هو تعدد القدماء المتغايرة المنفكة. And the summary of the answer is what is interdicted and negative of the affirmation of divine oneness is only the affirmation of multiple eternal beings, each distinct and separate. وصفات الذات ليست كذلك, but the essential attributes of Allah are not like this. فقوله ليست بغير الذات So he's saying they're not other than the entity. أي ليست مغايرة للذات منفكة عنها. They're not other than the entity, that they're not separate from the entity, and they're not separate from the entity, such that they can exist without the entity. أو قوله أو بعين الذات, and not the entity itself. أو بمعنى الواو. Right? أي وليست هي عين الذات, meaning that the صفات الذات, that the essential attributes are not the entity itself. أي بل لا يقال لها غير ولا عين. We don't say that they're other than the entity, and we don't say they're the entity itself. ولزوم الفساد بتعدد الآلهة إنما يحصل إن كانت قدماء منفكة. Because the absurdity of there being multiple gods only arises if we say there's multiple eternal beings. كل مستقل, each separate. أو كانت الصفات عين الذات, or if the attributes were the entity itself. لما يلزم عليه من أن العلم والقدرة إلى آخر الصفات عين الذات والذات عينها. Because that would entail that each of these, that knowledge and power and the remaining attributes would be the entity itself, and then the entity itself would be these attributes. Because if you say A equals B, then B equals A. That would be absurd too. Actually, if knowledge is Zayd, so knowledge equals Zayd, then Zayd equals knowledge. That would be absurd too. Okay? فعلم أن مذهب أهل السنة أن صفات الذات زائدة عليها قائمة بها. So from it's known, right, that the way of Ahl Sunnah is that the essential attributes are a meaning beyond the entity that subsists through the entity. لازمة لها, but necessary for it. لزوما لا يقبل الانفكاك, with a necessity that does not accept annulment. فهي دائمة الوجود مستحيلة العدم. Each of these attributes are actively eternal, absolutely absurd to cease to be. فهو حي بحياة عالم بعلم. So he is living with life, with بصفة هي الحياة. So he is living with an attribute of life, knowing with an عالم بعلم, knowing with an attribute of knowledge. قادر بقدرة, he is willing with an attribute called will, and so on. وقد نفى المعتزلة قبحهم الله تلك الصفات هروبا من تلك الشبهة. And the Mu'tazila negated these attributes, trying to flee from this shubha, from this confusion. وقالوا قادر بذاته. They said he is powerful just by his entity. He doesn't have the attribute of power. إلى آخرها. ومذهب باطل. And this is just an absurd stance. لكنه فسق. However, it is corrupt. وليس بكفر. But we don't say it's disbelief, because they're affirming the meaning. They just say Allah does not have an attribute that affirms that meaning. It's absurd and it's wrong, right? But it's not explicitly disbelief, right? ثم أعلم أن وجوب صفات المعاني ذاتي لها. And then know well that the necessity of the affirmative attributes for Allah is intrinsic for these attributes. مثل وجوب الذات, just as the entity is necessary. وليست بممكنة. The attributes are not in themselves possible. Right? ليست بالممكنة في نفسها واجبة بوجوب الذات. They're not in themselves possible and necessary by the necessity of the divine entity. خلافا لسعد الدين تبعا للفخر. Contrary to Sa'ad al-Din al-Taftazani, who followed al-Fakhr, Fakhr al-Din al-Razi in this. وتبعه أيضا جماعة, and some others followed him in this. كالبيضاوي rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, وشنع عليه ابن التلمساني. And Ibn al-Tilimsani attacked him vigorously about this. He attacked Fakhruddin al-Razi about this. Now this is a speculative investigation. Don't even include this in your notes. And there is, what they had to say and how it's understood. If you look in Sharh al-Maqasid, for example, even Sharh al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyah, it comes up more subtly in Sharh al-Aqaid, but if you look in the Hawashi and Sharh al-Aqaid, there's a way to understand what he is saying. Right? Because what they're saying is that they're not, that because it is impossible to conceive of an eternal attribute without an eternal entity. Right? In the sense that, could there be eternal knowledge without an eternal entity? But in eternity, so we affirm that in eternity, so there's no before and after, there is a necessary there is a necessary entity, and there are necessary attributes. Insofar as both are eternal, A is intrinsically necessary, B is intrinsically necessary. What these great giants said in a simplified way is that were one to conceive that there were no eternal entity, would there be eternal attributes? Would there be? No. Right? So this is a speculative investigation, right? The reason I'm just giving a very simplified contextualization for it, and it's not something to pursue, is don't imagine that these great imams were just way out there, they made some big huge blunder, because really if you had an all-star team of Ahl Sunnah, you had a starting lineup, right? You had, on one side you had Fakhruddin al-Razi, Baydawi, and Sa'd al-Din al-Taftazani, and then good luck being on the other side, right? As if you gathered on the same team, Ronaldo and Messi and Pelé and Platini and Beckenbauer and all the greats on one side. And it's not quite all the greats, and it's possible for, any great imam to err. Sometimes in ilm al-kalam, particularly because we're talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the ulama get very emotional and sometimes very rationally hard in attacking. You got to step back from the color of the rhetoric, because some of that is colored by the gravity of what they're talking about. So, and Ibn al-Tilimsani dispels it with firmness, but also you have to be careful. Great scholars, Ibn al-Tilimsani, though not at the level of these scholars, is a great scholar. They can say it, but if you don't even know the issue, right, and its nuances, if you're studying Sharh Sawi, you're not really equipped to really understand the nuances or terminology. Something, those of you who go on to study theology further would equip yourselves through the study of further mantiq and be trained to read the larger texts. Then you could begin to appreciate what is being said in Sharh al-Aqaid or Sharh al-Maqasid by Taftazani, what is being mentioned by Imam al-Razi rahimahullah ta'ala in various works of his on this issue, or what is mentioned in Tawali' al-Anwar, right? And and Tawali' al-Anwar now has several commentaries on it, like al-Isfahani's commentary and others. So actually several commentaries now on. Many of these issues are tied up really elegantly by Sajiqli Zada in two of the summary works in later theology that really tie up a lot of the khilaf between the great theologians of Ahl Sunnah. That are three. There's so many, but just three, right? And they're not necessarily something to, but one is Nashr al-Tawali' of Sajikli Zada, the author of Tartib al-Ulum, right? Right? And then there's Al-Mukhtasar al-Kalami, of Ibn Arafah. Right? And Mukhtasar al-Kalami, Mukhtasar doesn't mean the brief work. It means the summation. It's a 1,000-page summation of the positions of Ahl Sunnah. Right? And typically, and Ibn Arafah is quite late. He's just just was 2 generations before As-Sanusi, and one of the main influences of As-Sanusi. That's a brilliant work. And a third is Kashaf Istilahat Al-Funun of At-Tahanawi. Because it's not Ashraf Ali At-Tahanawi, this is an earlier Tahanawi. Right? These are useful. Of course, there's longer specialized works, but sort of to get the hasil. But if you go on any issue of kalam, typically if you go to Sharh al-Maqasid, Sharh al-Mawaqif, of Taftazani and Jurjani, you go to Razi, for example. Then you go to Kashaf Suhat al-Funun, you see that he summarized what they had to say with great navigational skill. Sometimes these kinds of books help gather the issue in the student's mind. Then when you go to the larger works, you're much clearer about the navigational landscape. Bismillah. Okay, so what did Ibn al-Tilimsani have to say? فقال رحمه الله, this is his words, صرح أي الفخر رحمه الله والعياذ بالله بكلمة لم يسبق إليه. Al-Fakhr said a statement that no one else said before. فقال هي ممكنة باعتبار ذاته. They are possible in of themselves. واجبة بوجوب ذاته. Necessary by the necessity of Allah's entity. جل وعلا, exalted and most high is He. وضاها قول الفلاسفة, and he said something like the statements of the philosophers. لا, العالم ممكن باعتبار ذاته, that the world is possible in of itself. واجب بوجوب مقتضيه, and necessary by necessity of what it entails. ونعوذ بالله من زلة عالم, and we seek Allah's refuge from the slip of a scholar. وبناها على اعتقاد صحة شبهة الفلاسفة, and he built this on believing the soundness of an argument raised by the philosophers بأن الافتقار بمعنى مطلق التوقف يوجب الإمكان. An issue that is raised by the philosophers that need, meaning one thing being contingent on another, entails that it is merely possible. Right? وَأَنَّ كُلَّ مُرَكَّبْ مُفْتَقِرْ إِلَى جُزْءٍ. And anything made up of parts is dependent on its parts. وَجُزْءُهُ غَيْرُهُ. And its part is other than it. وَالْمُفْتَقِرْ لِلْغَيْرِ لَا يَكُونُ إِلَّا مُمْكِنًا. And that which is in need of something else could only be possible. وَتَوَهَّمَ التَّرْكِيبْ بِاعْتِبَارِ الصِّفَاتِ. And he wrongfully imagined that there's an element of composition in consideration of the attributes. وَادَّعُوا بِأَنَّ الْإِمْكَانَ لَا يُنَافِي الْقِدَمِ. And they claim that it being possible does not negate eternity. وهي عقيدة باطلة تهدم كثيرا من مسائل أهل السنة. He says this is a false belief that demolishes many of the issues affirmed by Ahl Sunnah. And it's a bit of overstatement, right? A bit of overstatement. All you have to take notes on here is that the essential attributes of Allah, they're wajib in themselves, right? They're wajib in themselves. And don't get too emotional. And some people get, and these kinds of khilafat, we don't need to even think about them, right? But to imagine that these great imams were simpletons, no, these are nuanced, subtle issues. There's no real need to go into them, anyways, unless you have been equipped, right? And beware of just attacking Ahl Sunnah. And these are not issues to open up in public discourse, except where there's need to. And if there's need to, then specialists should speak, right? As daily press conferences by some people make clear, that you should either be a specialist when speaking about sensitive matters, or you should be speaking in a manner properly informed by specialists. والحاصل أن الصفات إما عين الذات وهي النفسية, and the summary is that the attributes are either the entity itself, and that is the personal attribute, namely being, أو غير الذات, or other than the entity, وهي السلبية, and these are the attributes of negation. لكون مدلولها سلبا, because what they indicate is a negation of that which is unbefitting the divine. والفعلية, or the attributes of action, لحدوثها, because those are not actual attributes, they are the originated manifestations of Allah's eternal attribute of power and will. أو لا عين الذات ولا غيرها, or they're neither the entity itself nor other than the entity, وهي وجودية وتسمى المعاني, and these are existent attributes, and these are called the attributes of meaning. Or أو لا عين الذات ولا غيرها وهي اعتبارية وتسمى معنوية, or those that are neither the entity itself nor other than the entity, and they're اعتبارية. They are matters of consideration, which are also موجودة, right? The أمر اعتباري is also موجود, but ليس له تحقق في الخارج, وتسمى معنوية. These are the attributes of meaning. أو صفات جامعة, or they are encompassing attributes, right? وهي أي مثل العزة والجلال والجمال والغنى ونحو ذلك, and these are things like Allah's being triumphant and majestic and beautiful and free of need, and the like of those attributes. And then he goes into a very important investigation, which is something that most students of knowledge don't pay enough attention to. It's very important to navigate sensitive theological issues. It's also very important spiritually to be able to reflect on what Allah tells us about Himself in the Quran, to reflect on the signs of Allah's creation, right? And in cultivating one's turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these are the ta'alluqat al-sifat, the relationships of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes. We will stop there. بإذن الله تعالى وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. How many pages do we do today? Sorry, البصر? No. السمع. 186 to 201. See? So we did a little bit of acceleration, right? Allah. Okay. Any questions here that are directly related to the text? Yeah, so inshallah, do remember the exercise. should task these straight during the class. صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وسلم.